Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. So after 37 years, it would appear that Robert Mugabe's time as the leader of Zimbabwe is over. He's under house arrest. The military have control of the radio stations and, indeed, the television, too. He himself would say that he'd fought for the rights of black people in Zimbabwe. He'd fought against white supremacists. He'd fought against the last days of the British Empire, and that he brought a better life to the people of Zimbabwe. But you can have a look at the other side of the coin, and you can see the stories of violence, the farm invasions, the hyperinflation that literally busts the country. And there are many that think Zimbabwe actually will be a lot better off without him. And I'm asking you tonight, do you see Mugabe as a freedom fighter or a dictator? And what do you think his legacy in African history will be? So let me know what you think by calling 0345 6060 973. You can text me on 84850. You can tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. And of course, you can watch the show live by going to LBC's Facebook page now and comment there too. Now, let's go to somebody who knows a bit of the history of this and who's visited Zimbabwe many times over the course of the last few years. His name's Peter Oborne. He's the associate editor of The Spectator. He's a columnist for the Daily Mail, and he made a film a few years ago, back in 2003, called Mugabe's Secret Famine, where he went undercover in Zimbabwe for a couple of weeks. Peter Oborne, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel.
Peter, remember that a lot of people listening to this will be under the age of 40 and simply won't remember any of the history of how this came about. Could you sort of remind people, or for the first time explain to people, how did the new country of Zimbabwe finish up with Robert Mugabe?
Well, I suppose it starts, the British invaded, or the British settlers invaded that part of Africa, then known as Rhodesia, or even southern Rhodesia, about 130 years ago. And we, maybe it's worth remembering, we were the ones who kicked the local Shona people and the local Nebele tribesmen off their land. And then we built a farm, we built a country, or the settlers did. And then it came to the post-war years, when we came to the ends of Macmillan's Winds of Change. You remember that?
Yep.
And we said, well, right, we're going to make you independent, and we're going to make you racially equal. And Ian Smith, the leader, said, no, we're not going to do that. We want to keep the way we are. We're not going to have equal votes for the majority black population. And at that point, there began a incredibly bloody war coming from Mozambique across the border. And one of the leaders of that war, that insurgency, was a certain Robert Mugabe. And eventually, Ian Smith's white Rhodesians sued for peace. There was a settlement at Lancaster House, overlooked by a certain Maggie Thatcher. You've probably heard of her. And then you had free elections in Mugabe in 1980. That's 37 years. Free elections in what was now called Zimbabwe in 1980.
Now, Ian Smith, who in 1965 declared UDI, a unilateral declaration of independence away from the United Kingdom, and he's portrayed, Peter, by many in history as being a sort of a white supremacist figure that opposed black people getting the vote. But isn't this, I mean, we weren't talking about apartheid in Rhodesia, were we? I mean, surely the truth about Smith is that actually he's not quite the monster that history tries to paint.
Well, it's certainly true that he carried on living and was allowed to carry on living quite peacefully in Mugabe, Zimbabwe. He was regarded with some affection by a lot of people. He was, of course, a World War II hero, a Spitfire pilot. I think I'm right in saying. But I mean, what he was fighting for was racial inequality. I mean, it was disgusting. Didn't
he, Peter? Didn't he accept that they would move to black majority rule, but that it was a question of time, and that it was the Soviets, it was the Marxists that were backing Nkomo and indeed backing Mugabe?
I think it's probably true, but the Soviets weren't always wrong on this issue. They were completely right. They were also backing in Namibia against white Africa. You know, they were against white apartheid.
Yes.
So the Soviets were completely right on that. And it's very significant, of course, that when did apartheid end? It ended the year after the fall of the wall, the end of Soviet communism. The United States and Britain propped up apartheid, one of the most disgusting systems ever known to man, for about 20 years until it was no longer needed to fend off the Soviets. So I don't see that as an argument, actually.
No, fine. So anyway, 1980, the new country of Zimbabwe comes into being. Mugabe takes over as the leader. Give us your... and how many times have you visited that country?
I'd say I've been there maybe 8 or 9 times. I first went in 2003 when Mugabe was starving his own people to death. It was a horrible thing he was doing, because he was using food as a political weapon to punish people who had voted against him. And these were not white people; these were black people.
Yeah.
And that's when I think that was roughly the moment when he started to go hideously wrong. But although he'd actually gone, I think the flaw was there right from the start. I mean, the idea that which was promulgated by Sir Nicholas Soames yesterday, that somehow he went wrong later on, is not true.
This is Nicholas Soames, of course, and it was his father, wasn't it, Christopher Soames, that was one of the main architects of the birth of Zimbabwe in many ways.
He was the final governor of what was Southern Rhodesia.
Yeah.
Nicholas Soames, his father, Christopher Soames, Lord Soames, the son-in-law of Winston Churchill, and he was a glorious sort of proconsular figure, and he got on like a house on fire with Mugabe, and they plotted what did look for a while a very hopeful future. But I think that it's very worth remembering that within a year of taking power, Mugabe was plotting the annihilation of his political tribal rivals, the Ndebele in Zimbabwe and Matabele land. And what we had was the Matabele land genocide. It went on quietly. The British pretended not to know it was going on, because we didn't want to know that Mugabe was doing such terrible things, because he was our person. And so, unbeknown to the world, 20,000 or so Ndebele Zimbabweans were murdered.
Yeah, I mean,
it was the first,
and then it carried on, didn't it? Yeah, I mean, Peter. I mean, will he go down in history as a monster?
History will curse him.
History will curse him. And tell me, what hope do you see? I mean, okay, he's under house arrest. We're not exactly sure what the situation is. Do you see any hope for Zimbabwe from here?
Funnily enough, I do feel hopeful. I feel very hopeful. One reason, I don't know if you've ever been, but I go with my family now on holiday. It is the most beautiful country, and the Zimbabwe people are the most wonderful people. You feel utterly welcome, relaxed, happy the moment you step into that glorious country. And you've had this sort of crony power elite using violence to maintain in power and stealing literally billions of pounds from the country, which you can't afford. And now that Mugabe has gone, I feel that we could move to something which would be much more hopeful. It's one of the reasons I mentioned the Matabele line genocide is that, of course, that it was carried out, it was on the orders of Mugabe, but carried out by his lieutenant, Emerson Mnangagwa, who is now going to come back and rule the country for the time being. Now, that is worrying, but if Mnangagwa sees the need for new elections, the world community gets behind it and takes a pragmatic line. I mean, we can't just say, why are we having a genocidal killer running this country? But maybe we should. This is a really difficult one. Do we say he's a genocidal killer, we're not going to have anything to do with him? Or do we say, look, this guy, maybe he's going to order the kind of army back to their barracks, he'll supervise free elections, a bit like, and maybe that is, and then he will retire gently and nobody, I mean, you see what I mean? These are the calculations.
Yeah, they're difficult.
Made. Yeah.
They're difficult. Well, let's hope we get it right. Peter Oborne, thank you. Thank you for joining us here on LBC and for sharing your knowledge of the place. So Peter Oborne there, who visited the country, who made a film about the way that Mugabe was using food and famine as a political weapon, the way that he obliterated and actually conducted genocides against some tribes in that country. Oborne clear that the man was a complete monster, but Peter Oborne also clear that the white rule under Rhodesia had to change and that Mugabe was an unfortunate consequence of that. And I wonder what Kelly, who's calling from Hull, who's a new caller to this show, so 37 years of Mugabe, Kelly, how do you view him?
Well, I feel that is that is a lot of a dictator, really. I've just been reading a lot about him recently, how the country was sort of thriving in the way of the farming industry. They had a lot of food what they shipped out. However, under Mugabe, when he got rid of all of the farmers, some which were brutally murdered, that the people who took over the farms didn't know how to cultivate the land, so they couldn't rotate the crops, they couldn't grow, so then they was having to import food in. Also, I did read as well that the average life expectancy in Zimbabwe has dropped from something like 59 to 58 under Mugabe's rule, and that a lot of with him being a dictator.
And of course, Kelly, that he managed to completely bankrupt the place.
Well, yes, I mean, look at inflation. Isn't it something ridiculous, like $1 billion sort of Zimbabwe
now,
whatever to buy a loaf of bread?
Now, get a handle on this, Kelly, get a handle on this. Right now, in the end, the Zimbabwean currency has collapsed and disappeared, but they went through a period of hyperinflation even greater than Germany went through in the Weimar Republic in 1923. And we've all heard those stories about people, having wheelbarrows of cash to take home from work and everything else. It got to the point where the Zimbabwean currency reached a rate, now prepare yourself for this, Kelly, of 35 quadrillion to $1. Now, I wonder how many people listening to this show know what a quadrillion is. I'll tell you what, I'm just as ignorant as all the rest of you. I had to really check it out carefully before the show. A quadrillion is 1 followed by 15 noughts. And it was. So there you are. That's 1 quadrillion, but it was 35 quadrillion. 35 of those were 15 noughts to $1. So, Kelly, he broke the country as well.
Oh, yes, most definitely. And with him being a dictator, all his political sort of opponents were thrown in jail, accused of homosexuality and so forth, as I read, and that is not somebody who believes in democracy. It's a dictator.
No. Did the British get the handover wrong, in your view, all those years ago?
I mean, obviously things wasn't perfect for it all to kick off and people wanting the country back. I understand that. It's maybe a similar issue with the whole Brexit thing. Was it right? No, I don't think it was. I think before it went over, it was probably the less of two evils. It was a thriving country with the farming and everything, and it's just sort of been ruined. My only fear is
been ruined. Kelly, I agree with you. I think it's been ruined. I thank you for your call. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show. 37 years of the appalling Mugabe. He's under house arrest. Hopefully he's gone for good, and maybe, just maybe, Zimbabwe has a bright, optimistic future now. Him and his Marxist crew are on the way out. At least I hope so. However, John from Lewisham says, in talking about the question of whether Mugabe is a freedom fighter or a dictator and what his legacy will be, John from Lewisham says, anything was better than Ian Smith in 1980. He was a racist. Mugabe has now had his time. And that's the cry, John. Everyone says that Smith was a racist, that he was a bad man because he did not want to move quickly to black majority rule. But I would remind people that this was not South Africa. This was not apartheid. The black education under Smith were actually getting an education. He did his damnedest to get them decent jobs as well. And perhaps the reason, and Peter Oborne mentioned this, the reason that Ian Smith was allowed to live unhassled until he died as a very old man, was that actually many people in that country, both black and white, actually rather respected and admired him. But he was seen as the devil. And so what happened here was the British were desperate to get rid of their empire. And at the time, Jimmy Carter was the US president, David Owen was the UK foreign secretary, and they basically thought that Rhodesia, though it wasn't apartheid, was similar in some way to South Africa, and that the move to black majority rule had to happen. And I remember one incident, a very sobering incident, that took place in 1978. This gives you some idea of just how horrendous the last few years of Rhodesia really was. And it involved Air Rhodesia Flight 825. It was shot down by Joshua Nkomo's ZIPRA, People's Revolutionary Army. It crashed. Of the 52 passengers, 38 of them died in the crash. Then, shortly afterwards, Nkomo's people approached the plane and shot 10 of the survivors dead in cold blood. This is the kind of thing that was going on. It was horrific. And in many ways, the British thought Nkomo would become the leader and not Mugabe. But the point about them both is the missile that was used to shoot this plane down was a Soviet-made Strela 2. So they talk today about did the Russians influence the American elections or Brexit? Believe you me, the Soviet Russians had a massive influence, and indeed they were the people who funded and supplied Mugabe in many, many ways. I am not, folks, arguing that Rhodesia was perfect, but I am arguing that it was making progress, that it wasn't South Africa. Mugabe is a dictator, a despot. Previous British governments should have sent in the SAS to take him out, says Hewitt from London. Well, Hewitt, frankly, once they got rid of Rhodesia and it was Zimbabwe, we haven't intervened in any way since. Nash is my next caller from Wolverhampton. Nash, good evening to you.
Very good evening to you, Nigel Farage. My name is Nyasha Madzima.
Nash, hello there. Now, I sort of detect that your accent means that you may well come from a southern part of the African continent somewhere.
Exactly, I come from Zimbabwe.
Right, okay. So how did you come to be in this country, Nash?
Well, I ran away from this despot. I was a sales manager at Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola packed these bags and I came here.
Yes.
Followed my wife, who was doing something, but basically I came to look for a living. But first of all, Nigel, may you allow me to associate myself with your famous phrase when you shouted, who is laughing now? Look, who is laughing?
Yes, okay.
That's exactly how I feel.
Right. And did you see, I mean, Nash, can I ask, how old are you?
I'm 43.
43. And so Mugabe became the leader when you were just a young boy?
Yes, he was. And my young brother was named after him. My young brother is called Gabriel.
Yes.
Because Mugabe was such a hero. He started as a hero. He ebbed away until he's now a despot. So he was seen,
by your family, Nash, they saw him as a heroic freedom fighter, yeah?
He was a big hero. There are a lot of Gabriels named after Robert Mugabe.
Yeah, Robert, because that's his name. His name is Robert Gabriel Mugabe. Yeah. So in the early days, when you're a boy, he's seen to be the new leader of a fresh country. You've broken away from the empire. You're doing your own thing. When, in your view, and here you are, having claimed asylum now from him, where did it go wrong, in your opinion?
When he started to listen to the war veterans. Number one. Number two, when he chucked white farmers out of the country.
Yes.
Because we live in a world of diversity. What others have a skill in, we might not have. So we needed those people. We could have shared land. But anyway, could you allow me to say what I want to say? Because you are giving me an agenda. I have something to say about what is happening now and why it is happening.
No, I want to hear from you. Of course I do.
Yes. Robert Mugabe was now personalizing Zimbabwe. Almost every road is called Robert Mugabe. The sat-nav will just get lost. Recently, he has just named the airport Robert Mugabe Airport.
That's me.
So, and his wife said even when Mugabe dies, we are going to put an X on the ballot paper against his name. Such was what he had become.
Nash, if he's gone, Nash, and it looks like he may have done, if he's gone, will you be pleased?
Yes, I will be the happiest person in the world.
Brilliant.
But
Nash, on that note, Nash, I have to move on, but I thank you for your call. Brilliant. There we are. That is fascinating, isn't it? Because, Nash is 5 years old when Mugabe becomes the leader. His family regard him as a hero, and now they see him as a villain. Caroline is calling me from Birmingham. Caroline, a new caller to the show. Good evening.
Oh, good evening, Nigel. How are you?
I'm well. So come on, tell me, you know Zimbabwe, I'm told.
Well, I don't just know Zimbabwe. I was born in Zimbabwe.
Right.
And I'm actually a Zimbabwean broadcaster, and we run a channel called Zimbo Live TV.
Okay.
We've been covering these issues for the last few days.
Right.
And so really, I was born there, and I emigrated to the UK about 20 years ago. And it's an interesting journey, to be honest.
Well, it is. But, Caroline, how do you think, as someone that knows the country well, how do you think the majority of the population today will view Mugabe's 37 years?
I think what's really tragic about the story of Robert Mugabe is the ending of it, to be honest, Nigel. It's a story that started with a lot of hope, a lot of expectation, and did deliver on the initial. So, as I say, I grew up there, and when we started there, it was a multiracial society. I went to multiracial schools. We had everything. Free healthcare, education. It was perfect. When I came to the UK, I didn't come here seeking asylum. I came to university and expected to go back. But things just happened so quickly, and the degeneration is unbelievable. And unfortunately for him, the end of it is one of tyranny and dictatorship, which is sad.
Would it be reasonable, Caroline? I mean, a lot of people say Smith was a racist, okay? Would it be reasonable to say that actually Mugabe behaved in a racist way too?
Well, I think it would be, but unfortunately, that would give a lot of leeway to maybe white supremacy.
No, I wasn't. No. I wasn't, Caroline. Caroline, I wasn't attempting. I wasn't attempting to do that in any way at all. But it does seem to me that as the years have gone by, the way that Mugabe has talked about the white settlers has become more and more vitriolic.
I mean, to be fair, if I was to be fair, the honest truth is, as I said to you, I grew up in a multiracial Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
White, black meant the same thing. So for somebody like myself that had been indoctrinated by the young Mugabe to be able to be a rainbow nation, he was the first person to implement that, and not Nelson Mandela. He was the first one to do truth and reconciliation, and not Nelson Mandela, actually. It was strange to then be expected to dislike somebody from a different race. So yes, there were some racial tendencies, particularly towards the end. So
yes.
Yeah, that is tragic. Yeah.
And Caroline, can you give us some feeling of hope, optimism for the future?
I mean, as I said to you, I run a program called The Diaspora Urgent Question on Zimbo Live TV, and to be honest with you, all of my viewers are totally excited about the prospect of not having him as president going forward from now. It's the hope, the expectation of sort of integration with the rest of the world, of progressing to the next level.
Well, let's hope. I hope all of that happens, Caroline. And I'll tell you something. I reckon a lot of investors, once they know he's gone, are going to look at a country that's got some pretty amazing resources, phenomenal ability to grow food and to do stuff if it was properly managed. I think, Caroline, there'll be a flood of investment coming into Zimbabwe once this guy is gone, and I thank you very much indeed for your expertise and your call. After 37 years that have ended, in my view, in disaster, it looks like Mugabe has gone and that Zimbabwe has a chance to get a new leader and a fresh start. Let's hope they do. But before I get back to your calls on that, I'm very pleased to get people who were born in that country and have worked in that country calling me. Goldman Sachs. Now, I have talked about Goldman Sachs before on this programme, and their chief executive, Lloyd Blankfein. Now, as you know, they did bankroll quite a lot of the Remain campaign in the referendum. They love the European Union. Well, they virtually run it, actually. You know, when the Italian Prime Minister is removed or the Greek Prime Minister is removed, you get unelected new Prime Ministers take over in both of those countries. It's happened, folks, in the last few years, and both of them, guess what, had been directors of Goldman Sachs. No wonder they like it. But today, the Chief Executive, Lloyd Blankfein, has said that maybe we should hold another referendum on Brexit. Yes, that's right. Blankfein tweeted, here in the UK, lots of hand-wringing from CEOs over Brexit, so much at stake. Why not make sure the consensus is still there? Well, I tell you what, matey, the consensus is actually a lot bigger now than it was then. But rather than me going into full splenetic mode about the boss of Goldman Sachs, I heard today Noel Gallagher. Yeah, Noel Gallagher, remember Oasis rock star 1990s? He was talking to NME earlier on about the referendum result and particularly about those that want to overturn it.
It's kind of like it was put to the people as a vote. The people voted. That's democracy. Get over it. You know, I didn't vote because I didn't think we should have been given the vote in the first place because as ordinary members of the public, how the you qualified to talk about the breakup of the oldest continent in the world? And then the people trying to get the vote overturned, they used to call that fascism.
What a lad. I like that. Now, look, lots of bleeping. The F word did feature more than once in the space of 30 seconds, but that aside, I love the point that the people that want to overturn this, that's what we used to call fascism. So that is my answer to Goldman Sachs. Not in my own words. I think Noel Gallagher has done it very effectively for all of us. Loved every minute of that. Simon Snape says to me on Facebook, he says, Mugabe will be remembered as a typical tin pot Marxist tyrant who ruined a viable state that should have been an African role model. And he did so in pursuit of his own personal gain. Tom Smith says, to me, a murderer, a terrorist, and any other sort of despot you can name, he should be charged for murder. And Ludwig, I don't know you, Ludwig, but you're clearly a very charming fellow. Ludwig says, Robert Mugabe was just your African alter ego, Nigel. You couldn't make some of this stuff up, could you? He was a strong and stable leader who took control of his nation's borders, reclaimed sovereignty from unelected Europeans, and stopped the immigrants from Europe stealing his country's resources. Well, nice try, Ludwig. But I don't actually think I've ever advocated completely destroying democracy, starving millions of people, or indeed ethnically cleansing people I didn't like. So, yeah, all right, you've had your bit of fun. Nigel, in answer to your question, Mugabe was a monster, but from the press reports, there is an even worse one waiting in the wings. Well, Peter Oborne was talking a little bit about that. Let's see what happens. Clearly, if they can have proper, free and fresh elections, maybe they can head for a better start. Why don't we all cross our fingers and wish them that after what they've been through in the last couple of decades? Fiona is calling from Putney. Good evening, Fiona.
Hello, Nigel.
So what do you think?
Well, as far as Mugabe's concerned, in my personal opinion, having lived there
yes,
since I was 18 months old, went to school there, etc., he's a terrorist, he's a murderer and a dictator. My opinion is that Rhodesia was doing quite okay under Smith. And the reason why Smith didn't want Mugabe in was because we all knew what Mugabe was like. And here comes England, Thatcher era, and puts Mugabe into power. Well, thank you very much, England. You have to stand and take your place as to what has actually happened to Rhodesia and to the people there. Now, that was why they had a war, was because because the Smith era did not want Mugabe in, and this is exactly why. He's managed to rule all this time through utter intimidation, his murderous atrocities. He would cut people. Nigel, I don't know whether I can say these things on live air, but the atrocities that he did was absolutely, you couldn't think about it.
No. Well, Fiona, we don't need to go into the lurid details. It's only 20 to 8 in the evening, but I know terrible things happened. And I talked earlier about that plane crash. And I remember that Nkomo the next day was almost laughing on television about the fact they'd shot down this airliner of civilians, and then his thugs had gone and shot the survivors. I mean, some terrible things were happening, weren't they?
Nigel, my friend died in that. Cheryl Tilley, she died in that Viscount disaster.
Gosh.
But that's only one. My family were driven off their farm. My grandmother was murdered. I mean, all of these things just shouldn't happen. But if I have anything that I can say, that would be leave Africa to the Africans. To sit in England, which is Europe, we're Europeans here. There is no concept of what life is like in Africa until you've been there, lived there. It is so deep-rooted in history, in culture. They're very, very proud people. People from England cannot live the way we do and expect the Africans to live exactly the same as what we do. They are totally
Well, Fiona,
different.
one thing I want to say to you is that this transition out of Rhodesia into Zimbabwe, of course, it straddled, didn't it, the last days of that Labour government and the first days of the Thatcher government in 79. With you, I think the British establishment should hang their heads in shame at what they did, handing over this country, effectively, to these Soviet-backed Marxists, and then, having done nothing, frankly nothing to help or improve the situation for the last 37 years, and I completely understand and agree with you on that. Do you, Fiona, and your story is pretty horrific in many ways, do you see any hope for the future?
I'd like to think so. I'd really, really like to think so. They do need, it is time for change. They do need fresh blood. But they do need help. They need help. South Africa needs help. The murders now that are carrying on in the farms in South Africa.
It's got worse again, hasn't it? Yeah.
It's Zimbabwe all over again, and this has nothing to do with apartheid. Don't banter that word around. It's nothing to do with it. It's nothing to do with it at all. It's intimidation, Nigel. That's what it is. And all I can say is leave Africa to the Africans. But I think that there are vast opportunities for investors to go into that country.
So do I.
It used to have thriving farms. The farms were amazing. I mean, you know, when they used to have, when they were absolutely landlocked, you know, the equity ban, they had absolutely nothing. We had fuel rationing, food was rationed, but as a nation, we coped and we survived and we managed.
Yeah.
And the camaraderie between, you know, all the residents of the country, of Rhodesians, black, white, and every other colour, was absolutely phenomenal. And any Rhodesian or Zimbabwean will tell you that.
Well, this is I must admit, Fiona, I've spoken to people who lived there in the 70s who said it wasn't like South Africa. There wasn't this huge division. People did mix together. Fiona, I want to thank you for your phone call, for your comments, and for being brave and talking about some pretty horrendous things that have happened to you and your family. I thank you very much indeed. My next caller is Marakia, who's calling from Reading. Marakia, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. So tell me your interest in this.
Okay, I'm the current EU chairman for Zimbabwe People First. It's an opposition party in Zimbabwe.
Yep.
Which was headed by the former VP Joyce Mujuru, and then we separated at some point because of differences, and she went and formed her own political party.
Okay, so you have a direct interest in this, and I guess you're pleased to see Mugabe appears no longer to be in charge.
Yes, I'm pleased, but we've got a problem.
Go on.
What the world is thinking is not actually what is happening on the ground. Okay, the problem we are having at the moment is Mugabe technically is still in charge, because what the army was trying to do was to try and force Mugabe in a diplomatic way, out of respect of Mugabe, to hand over power diplomatically, so that we don't have a situation whereby the international community would say, look, there is a coup in Zimbabwe, so we have a duty of care to stop this coup and intervene. So this is the situation we are at now.
Okay.
What the international community is thinking now is Mugabe has not stepped down. There is a possibility that if things are not handled properly, Mugabe could actually come back and be the president of Zimbabwe again.
Do you really believe that?
That's what is happening at the moment, because constitutionally Mugabe is still the president.
Yeah.
The army, although he's still under arrest, that's why you hear the army saying there is no coup in Zimbabwe. He is only under house arrest.
Yeah, I know. It's an unusual... We're a sort of halfway house land here. I do accept that it's unusual. But let me ask you one question, please. Assuming that he does go, and after, he's 93, he won't be there forever, whatever happens at the moment. But do you see, Marakia, do you see a bright, optimistic future for Zimbabwe?
Okay, when you are talking about do I assume, the problem that we are having at the moment is I cannot assume until we cross this bridge. So the question is, how do we cross this bridge?
Okay.
Okay, this is my challenge.
Okay. So once Mugabe... So Mugabe needs to go. That's obviously clear.
If that happens, so the next 72 hours are very crucial in Zimbabwe.
Right.
If we don't make the right decision and if we don't get the right support, then we are in a crisis situation.
Thank you. Listen, I'm going to be returning to this subject, I'm sure, over the course of the next week or so, and given your role in an opposition party, let's talk again. Thank you. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. We're discussing what Mugabe's legacy will be. 30 years of Mugabe may well be at an end. It's not certain, but it looks that way. And I'm asking you, was he a freedom fighter or a dictator? What will his legacy be? And Grace, a new caller to the show, is calling me from South Woodford. Grace, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
I'm fine. So how do you view 37 years of Mugabe?
Well, in the same way that I think you viewed the Leave vote. You fought for sovereignty for your country.
I never shot... I didn't shoot down aeroplanes, Grace.
But you didn't have aeroplanes shooting at you and soldiers shooting at you. So I think... in the same way the Zimbabwean people...
Grace, Nkomo shot down that plane full of civilians, men, women and children, going from Victoria Falls to Salisbury.
I think, Nigel, we can name lots of different instances of atrocities that have happened in Africa by the British government, in Zimbabwe, in Rhodesia. I'm from Zimbabwe.
Yep.
My father had to flee Rhodesia when I was 4 years old, to come to England to seek asylum from Ian Smith.
Because?
Because of the Ian Smith's government, because my father was one of the people that were fighting for the liberation of the country. Yeah.
When you say the Grace, when you say the liberation, do you mean the liberation...
Wait a minute, Nigel.
Do you mean the liberation from the British Empire,
Nigel,
or the liberation from white control?
Nigel, I think you put a gloss. I think you fought for the sovereignty and the freedom for your country. You didn't have to do it by picking up a gun and defending yourself against guns. You didn't have to do that. You had a democratic process that you were able to do that through. And I respect you for that. And I actually voted Leave because I believe every people has a right of self-determination and to control and run their own country. So I don't understand why it's good enough for the British, but it's not good enough for the Africans.
Well, is it possible, Grace? Is it possible? And interestingly, you may have heard Nash, who called up earlier, who was born in Rhodesia, and when he was 5, it became Zimbabwe, and he said his family viewed Mugabe as a hero. His brother was named Gabriel after Mugabe's middle name, and they as a family, at that time, did see Mugabe as a freedom fighter, did see him as somebody, who'd got black people equal rights and the vote on all of those things, but as the years went by, believed that he turned into a monster. Would that be, perhaps to you, a reasonable way of looking at this man's life?
No, it wouldn't be, because I would say to you, in every single country, every leader has people that are for them and against them.
Of course.
In this country, we have people that support the government, we have people that are anti the government, we have people that are actively very against the government, and that's the same in every country. So I'm sure there's children that were born and named Margaret Thatcher because their parents really admired Margaret Thatcher, but maybe by the end of her legacy, they didn't admire her so much. Mm-hmm. That happens. That's just an anecdotal little story. But I'll say to you, I returned to Zimbabwe when I was 13. Straight after independence in 1982.
Yeah.
And when people say, oh, it was a rainbow, it's a load of rubbish. I had never suffered racism in this country from 4 till I was 13. I'd never been called a name. Racism existed, but I was not aware of it as a child. When I went to Zimbabwe at 13, went to an ex-white school, I experienced racism for the first time properly, bluntly in my face, because the white children there had been brought up in such a way that it was normal for them to think black people were inferior, were below them. The black people had been brought up that white people are your masters, they're your superiors. You had all those attitudes, and anybody says that didn't happen after independence. I was there in 1982 as a 13-year-old, from the eyes of a child, yeah? I stayed there till I was 16, 17. I've been going back to Zimbabwe continually since then. So for me, there isn't a debate about whether he was a freedom fighter or not, because he fought for the freedom of his country. So he was a freedom fighter. What the debate is was that a success or not? And if it wasn't a success, why wasn't it a success? So that's the debate.
Yeah, OK, no, Grace, that's fine. And, you know, maybe one would say that he was so wedded to Marxist ideology that he broke the country, he destroyed the currency. And Peter Oborne, who was on the show earlier, you know, made a film saying that Mugabe used starvation as a political weapon. It's not a very good legacy in office, is it?
It's just standard nonsense. There were factors, sanctions. Up until 27 years into independence, Zimbabwe was prospering, Zimbabwe was doing well. When the sanctions hit, it had a dramatic effect on the country. It led to a brain drain, it led to a loss of jobs, it led to lots of things, it led to lack of medication, all kinds of things. So I think we need to be honest. And
do you think, Grace, and I'm going to ask you one last question, I must move on, but I'll ask you one last important question. Do you think when people look back, 50 years' time, 100 years' time, and they look back, and, hey, a lot of Africa's troubled, isn't it? It's not just Zimbabwe. A lot of it's got real problems. Do you think history in the end will be kind to Mugabe?
Yeah, a lot of Europe is troubled at the moment. The difference is Africa has a lot of world resources that everybody wants. And if you look at the countries with the richest natural resources, they've constantly got problems, they've constantly got war. And we have to ask the question, why?
OK. No, Grace, listen, you've made a very, very strong, very powerful call. And Grace, you know, growing up in a country where her father did not feel comfortable under a white-dominated regime, thinks Mugabe actually was a freedom fighter and, in a way, did a bit of good. I can't believe it, I'm saying this, says someone on Twitter, but I actually enjoy it when Nigel's on LBC. Well, there you go, name. All sorts of odd things happen in life, don't they? Amazing how people come on to defend Mugabe. He enriched himself beyond all imagination and ran Zimbabwe into the ground. What did Zimbabwe have before? Candles, electricity, says it. Right, so he's saying, now they've got candles, before they had electricity, Lisa reckons he's wrecked the place. I've got time for one last caller. That's Simon from Coventry, new caller to the show. Good evening, Simon.
Good evening, Nigel.
Haven't got long, Simon. You've got 45 seconds. Tell us what you think Mugabe's legacy will be.
He's gonna be the greatest African to ever live.
Is he?
His mindset, which has left us, is amazing. We are going to be an amazing people because of Mugabe. He has taught us to be ourselves. We might be difficult now, but the children growing up know freedom, know what is to be free because of that man's stance.
And you think, and do you feel, Simon, that, people starving, the currency disappearing, Zimbabwe's reputation in the world going down the drain, and despite all of that, you think he'll go down as one of the greatest Africans in history?
He's probably the greatest, well after Mandela. Even in England here, there were periods where people were starving. Go to history of England here. People were starving here, people were on coupons. It happens historical. All countries go through this period. But it doesn't make Churchill not a great leader. You look at the overall.
All right,
what
Simon, I'm sorry. I let you go on longer than I was going to because I was so fascinated by what you have to say. Thank you. Well, folks, this is LBC, and it does allow a huge range of opinions. And you've just heard there that Simon, who lives in Coventry's view, is that Mugabe will go down as the greatest African of all time, perhaps even greater than Mandela. And I fundamentally disagree with that on a whole load of levels. But it does show you what a great radio station this is. The fact we engage the public and everyone, provided they're polite, gets to have their say. You've been listening to The Nigel Farage Show.